Nathaniel Prentice Banks was an American politician from Massachusetts and a Union general during the American Civil War. A millworker by background, Banks was prominent in local debating societies, and his oratorical skills were noted by the Democratic Party. But his abolitionist views fitted him better for the nascent Republican Party, through which he became Speaker of the United States House of Representatives and Governor of Massachusetts in the 1850s. At the outbreak of the Civil War, President Lincoln appointed Banks as one of the first political major generals, over the heads of West Point regulars, who initially resented him, but came to acknowledge his influence on the administration of the war. After suffering a series of inglorious setbacks in the Shenandoah River Valley at the hands of Stonewall Jackson, Banks replaced Benjamin Butler at New Orleans as commander of the Department of the Gulf, charged with administration of Louisiana and gaining control of Mississippi River, but he failed to reinforce Grant at Vicksburg, and badly handled the siege of Port Hudson, taking its surrender after Vicksburg had fallen. He then launched the Red River Campaign, a failed attempt to occupy eastern Texas that prompted his recall. Banks was also instrumental in early Reconstruction efforts in Louisiana, intended by Lincoln as a model for later such activities. After the war, Banks returned to the Massachusetts political scene, serving in Congress, where he influenced the Alaska Purchase legislation and supported women's suffrage. Early life. Nathaniel Prentice Banks was born at Waltham, Massachusetts, the first child of Nathaniel P. Banks, Sr., and Rebecca Greenwood Banks, on January 30, 1816. His father worked in the textile mill of the Boston Manufacturing Company, eventually becoming a foreman. Banks went to local schools until the age of 14, at which point the family's financial demands compelled him to take a job in the mill. He started as a bobbin boy, responsible for replacing bobbins full of thread with empty ones, working in the mills of both Waltham and Lowell. Because of this role, he became known as Bobbin Boy Banks, a nickname he carried throughout his life. He was at one time apprenticed as a mechanic alongside Elias Howe, a cousin. Recognizing the value of education, Banks continued to read, sometimes walking to Boston on his days off to visit the Athenaeum Library. He attended company-sponsored lectures by luminaries of the day, including Daniel Webster and other orators. He formed a debate club with other mill workers to improve their oratorical skills, and took up acting. He became involved in the local temperance movement. Speaking at its events brought him to the attention of Democratic Party leaders, who asked him to speak at campaign events during the 1840 elections. He honed his oratorical and political skills by emulating Robert Rantoul, Jr., a Democratic congressman who also had humble beginnings. His personal good looks, voice, and flair for presentation were all assets that he used to gain advantage in the political sphere, and he deliberately sought to present himself with a more aristocratic bearing than was suggested by his humble beginnings. Banks's success as a speaker convinced him to quit the mill. He first worked as an editor for two short-lived political newspapers. After they failed, he ran for a seat in the state legislature in 1844, but lost. He then applied to Rantoul, who had been appointed collector of the Port of Boston, for a job. The job, which he held until political changes forced him out in 1849, gave him sufficient security that he was able to marry Mary Theodosia Palmer, an ex-factory employee he had been courting for some time. Banks again ran unsuccessfully for the state legislature in 1847. Antebellum political career. In 1848, Banks was victorious in another run for the state legislature, successfully organizing elements in Waltham whose votes were not easily controlled by the Whig-controlled Boston Manufacturing Company. He was at first moderate in opposition to the expansion of slavery, but recognizing the potency presidency of the burgeoning abolitionist movement. He became more strongly attached to that cause as a vehicle for political advancement. This brought Banks, along with fellow Democrats Nathaniel and George S. Boutwell, to form a coalition with the Free Soil Party that successfully gained control of the legislature and governor's chair. The deals negotiated after the coalition win in the 1850 election put Boutwell in the governor's chair and made Banks the Speaker of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Although Banks did not like the radical Free Soiler Charles Sumner, he supported the coalition agreement that resulted in Sumner's election to the United States Senate, despite opposition from conservative Democrats. His role as House Speaker and his effectiveness in conducting business raised his status significantly, as did side work he did doing publicity work for the State Board of Education. Congress in 1852, Banks sought the Democratic nomination for a seat in the United States Congress. While it was at first granted, his refusal to disavow abolitionist positions meant support was withdrawn by party conservatives. He ended up winning a narrow victory anyway, with Free Soil's support. In 1853, he presided over the State Constitutional Convention of 1853. This convention produced a series of proposals for constitutional reform, including a new constitution, all of which were rejected by voters. The failure, which was led by Whigs and conservative anti-abolitionist Democrats, spelled the end of the Democratic Free Soil Coalition. In Congress, Banks sat on the Committee of Military Affairs. He bucked the Democratic Party line by voting against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which overturned the 1820 Missouri Compromise. Using his parliamentary skills in an effort to keep the bill from coming to a vote, supported by his constituents, he then publicly endorsed the abolitionist cause. His opposition came despite long-stated support for Manifest Destiny, which the bill's proponents claimed it furthered. In 1854 he formally joined the Know Nothing cause, was renominated for Congress by the Democrats and Free Soilers, and won an easy victory in the Know Nothing landslide. Banks was, along with Wilson and Governor Henry J. Gardner, one of the leaders of the movement, although none of the three strongly supported the movement's nativist core. In 1855, Banks agreed to chair the convention of a new Republican Party convention, whose platform was intended to bring together anti-slavery interests from the Democrats, Whigs, Free Soilers, and Know Nothings. When Know Nothing Governor Henry Gardner refused to join in the fusion, Banks carefully kept his options open, passively supporting the Republican effort but also avoiding criticism of Gardner in his speeches. Gardner was re-elected. During the summer of 1855, Banks was invited to speak at an anti-slavery rally in Portland, Maine, his first major speaking opportunity outside Massachusetts. In the speech, Banks expressed his opinion that the Union did not necessarily need to be preserved, say that under certain conditions it would be appropriate to let slide. Future political opponents would repeatedly use these words against him, accusing him of disunionism. At the opening of the 34th Congress in December 1855, representatives from several parties opposed to slavery spread gradually united in supporting Banks for Speaker. After the longest and one of the most bitter speakership contests on record, lasting from December 3, 1855 to February 2, 1856, Banks was chosen on the 133rd ballot. This victory was lauded at the time as the first Republican victory and first Northern victory, and greatly raised Banks' profile. He gave anti-slavery men important posts in Congress for the first time, and cooperated with investigations of both the Kansas Kansas conflict and the caning of Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate. Because of his fairness in dealing with the numerous factions, as well as his parliamentary ability, Banks was lauded by others in the body, including former Speaker Hal Cobb, who called him, in all respects, the best presiding officer had ever seen. Banks played a key role in 1856 in bringing forward John C. Fremont as a moderate Republican presidential nominee. Because of his success as Speaker, Banks was considered a possible presidential contender, and his name was put in nomination by supporters at the Know Nothing convention held 1 week before the Republicans met. Banks then refused the Know Nothing nomination, which went instead to former President Millard Fillmore. Banks was active on the stump in support of Fremont, who lost the election to James Buchanan. Banks easily won re-election to his own seat. Democrats, however, regained control of the House of Representatives, depriving him of the speakership. Governor of Massachusetts. In 1857, Banks ran for governor of Massachusetts against the incumbent Henry Gardner. His nomination by the Republicans was contentious, with opposition coming primarily from radical anti-slavery interests opposed to his comparatively moderate stand on the issue. After a contentious campaign, Banks won a comfortable victory. One key action Banks took in support of the anti-slavery movement was the dismissal of Judge Edward G. Loring. Loring had ruled in 1854 that Anthony Burns, a fugitive slave, be returned to slavery under the terms of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Under the pressure of a public petition campaign spearheaded by William Lloyd Garrison, the legislature passed 2 bills of address, in 1855 and 1856, calling for Judge Loring to be removed from his state office. But in both cases Governor Gardner declined to remove Loring. Banks signed a third such bill in 1858. He was rewarded with significant anti-slavery support, easily winning re-election in 1858. Banks's 1859 re-election was influenced by 2 significant issues. One was a state constitutional amendment requiring newly naturalized citizens to wait 2 years before becoming eligible to vote. Promoted by the state's Know Nothings, it was passed by referendum in May of that year. Banks, catering to Know Nothing supporters, supported its passage, although Republicans elsewhere opposed such measures, because they were seeking immigrant votes. The other issue was John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which more radical Republicans expressed sympathy for. Not yet ready for armed conflict, the state voted for the more moderate Banks. After the election, Banks vetoed a series of bills over provisions removing a restriction limiting state militia participation to whites. This incensed the radical abolitionist forces in the legislature, but they were unable to override his vetoes in either that legislative session, or of similar bills passed in the next. Banks made a serious attempt to gain the Republican presidential nomination in 1860, but dislike of him by the radicals in the state party harmed him. His failure to secure a majority in the state delegation prompted him to skip the national convention, where he received first ballot votes as a nominee for vice president. His attempt to promote Henry L. Dawes, another moderate Republican, as his successor in the governor's chair also failed. The party nominated the radical John Andrew, who went on to win the general election. Banks's farewell speech, given with Civil War looming, was an appeal for moderation and union. In the summer of 1860, Banks accepted an offer to become a resident director of the Illinois Central Railroad, which had previously employed his mentor Robert Rantoul. Banks moved to Chicago after leaving office, and was engaged primarily in the promotion and sale of the railroad's extensive lands. He continued to speak out in Illinois against the breakup of the Union.